Three, two, one, go. The promise of neoliberalism enabled delusions that led to mass inequality is unlikely to be reversed with its system. The rich keeps getting richer, the poor poorer. As an economist, I cannot protect this. Let's have a few technical clarifications before we start. They say that when neoliberalism is applied, this is where price is determined by supply and demand. They imply that in protectionist policy, only the government determines the prices. They are wrong. Supply and demand is largely an aspect of what we call market economy, and neoliberalism just adapts that as one of its core tenets. It is not something that they only have. Under protectionist policies, market economies are still existent. Second, they say that China's used neoliberalism to their advantage to like uplift poverty. But what they fail to understand is that it is not neoliberalism by itself, it is free market capitalism. But sure, yes, but they don't understand what was used to prevent the penetration of monopolies within China. It is protectionist policies. It's nationalizing a lot of their services. It's improving the poverty alleviation. Neoliberalism as an ideology on its work because when it is unleashed, you get what you have in status quo. Few floating responses before I move on to my extensions. First, take a note at the rhetoric of LO. Every means they have to be able to challenge the oppressive structures created by neoliberalism has largely been through war and conflict. The genocide of Pol Pot with the Khmer Rouge proves Kuya Yosef's case, of which we heard little to no response. And this is important because it is inherently what made neoliberalism such a core part of like global integration. Second, leader of opposition has an interesting case study about China and Japan, right? Even if nations can rise to power and economic capacity, are they in any way able to challenge the USA in the moment? And the answer to that is obviously no. Even after all this development, they remain developing nations as compared to the US hegemonic power. This debate is not about economic development and potential, but about value judgment on the wealth divide and discrepancy that has created. We explained that there are promises that neoliberalism made that it has failed to adhere to. Kuya Yusuf was quite clear that even if nations have motivation and capacity, the status quo has largely led to all these nations trying and failing to play catch up to the West. Notice a lot of the examples are historical analysis and what made it better or what made it good in those time periods, but didn't largely make it or tie it back to what's happening right now in status quo. This is the failure of the comparative because they don't really acknowledge that we're talking about how it is currently now. What is the state of neoliberalism, where it has led to? Third, the case of growth, development, and innovation was already preempted by Kuya Yusuf in the top of his speech that opposition again failed to contend with. Supply and demand has largely been skewed to those first mover advantage and economies of scale, which can happen, but significantly put a huge strain on the government and economies and people of those countries, right? Because they aren't able to really respond to these ideas, they only want to take their best case and not really address what is the reality of like neoliberalist policies and its interactions with developing countries, they automatically lose. And going on to an extension relating to this is on this idea that if you are rich, it creates a perverse incentive structure to exploit the poor. So this is related to the economic failure of neoliberalism. How did this happen? First is you're incentivized to create businesses to probably hire geniuses who may or may not have the same amount of wealth as you. And because neoliberalism has promoted the idea of lowering taxes for the rich, for example, Rogernomics back in New Zealand, or the lowering of taxes post World War II, post conflict nations, there is a crazy high return on investment that you may have. You respond to these conditions that instead of getting a job since you are rich, you might just want to inherit your parents' business. And if you don't wanna, you can just have a startup and fund the advertisement of this because you have so much money. At first, the best case scenario is maybe you're passionate about your technological advancement. For example, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, etc. So you end up hiring a lot of reliable employees. You exponentially grow through your connections, profit, etc. Under neoliberalism, you are encouraged to expand and even try to attain a monopoly. Opposition doesn't really acknowledge the incentive structures that may exist when neoliberalism is the core tenet or is the main philosophy that every developing nation is going under and every person like looks at as the Hail Mary. What do these incentive structures look like? It's converging being bought by a company. For example, BlackRock, JP Morgan, Netflix, WWE, etc. All these companies started small, right? And what makes this even worse is that neoliberalism promotes competition as a means of producing development. Monopolies are an antithesis to the competition and idealism of neoliberalism. Second, it's just the constant lobbying against things like sin taxes for like tobacco and alcohol, or higher taxes in general, so that you maintain that sweet return on investment. What happened was that the rich, especially those from the West, now hold a lot of leverage and power over other developing countries. And within these countries, the elites control more than 80% of businesses through things like multinational corporations like Unilever, because even MSMEs within these countries are just subsidiaries or branches of these bigger companies. Competition is effectively just turned into a myth, and the neoliberal delusion of the invisible hand. Under protectionism, on the other hand, governments were inherently incentivized to maximize the returns of taxes for the developed and under country. For example, China's progressive taxation used for things like environmental improvement, poverty alleviation, etc. And you also have nationalized products that do not rely on importing from the West, like those in Vietnam, right? Sure, let's take them at their best. Inequality happens in protectionist policies as well. But what Kuya Yosef and I uniquely explain is how neoliberalism exacerbated inequality worse than it already is. And lastly, when it comes to this idea of like what happened to the poor under neoliberalism assumes that everybody has the capacity to uplift themselves so long as they abide by these rules. It's a free country, a democracy, just invest, start a business. But these are all literally impossible without nepotism. American dream essentially becomes an illusion. You don't have the right to pursue life, liberty, and happiness, right? Because in actuality, what does it look like? It looks like you enter in a low minimum wage job that you barely scrap by, because even Laude graduates do not have the capacity to actually have a lot of money right off the bat. So meaning they don't get a better life like what leader of opposition is trying to tell you. The poor is stuck in this system and they aren't able to go upwards because the system necessarily needs for those poor people to be under those conditions for their monopolies to thrive. Here.